All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
It's been a wild, long weekend in American politics, and there was a lot of fodder for today's radar, but I settled in on a question that I want to spend the next 4 years tracking, which is the irreparable damage that the Trump era did to the credibility of the mainstream media, how the media's decision to abandon standards under Trump will harm it for decades to come. This, I believe, may be one of the most important stories of this age, because as we learned over the last 4 years, despite the complete beclowning that these people have undertaken, millions and millions of Americans still listen to them in good faith, and they control our politics, whether we like it or not. Today's story, as usual, begins over at the New York Times, which in the last few weeks has reached insanity heights we did not even think possible, with Taylor Lorenz lying about Mark Andreessen on Clubhouse, the firing of reporter Donald McNeil for using a racial slur while in a context almost a decade ago, and now with the smearing of a small but influential columnist known to me and many others as Scott Alexander of Slate Star Codex. Now, Scott, for years, has tapped away insightful essays on public policy and psychology and politics and culture over at his blog. It has earned a small but dedicated following among those who value free expression in an age where the majority of the media is so predictable and boring. Well, Scott's crime was his free expression, and the New York Times has taken notice. Several months ago, Scott revealed on his blog that he was going to delete the entire thing and go underground. Why? Because he was informed that the New York Times reporter Cade Metz was going to reveal his real name in the paper and connect him to unsavory views, not of himself, but of some people who read his blog. Scott's full name was immaterial. As he said at the time, he's a practicing psychiatrist and he could suffer professional and personal backlash. More so, he is not a public figure in any way. He's a pseudonymous blogger with an influential audience, but in no way did his name need to be made public. A public outcry ensued at the time, and the Times appeared to have backed down. But the damage was largely done. Enough snooping by outcry and largely unmasked Scott's full name, and eventually he just embraced it. He moved to Substack recently and has decided to write under his own name, choosing to unmask himself rather than allow himself to be unmasked by the New York Times. They, of course, could not forget the slight, and what they've done to him now is truly disgusting. On the news that his name was out there, they ran their profile titled, quote, Silicon Valley's Safe Space. What exactly are the crimes that are outlined therein? Well, basically, that influential, non-left-wing billionaires like Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, and a few others maybe have read or even been connected to Scott's work. They call themselves rationalists, and they question basic liberal dogma. In the opening paragraphs of the story, they quote a supporter of the blog who notes that Scott's audience ranges from anarcho-capitalists to Catholics, atheists, and rocket scientists. But then, of course, they have to add this piece. The voices also included white supremacists and neo-fascists. That's it. That's a death knell. We all know what that means. Scott, because some bad people were in his comments section, is now himself a racist neo-fascist. So let's review the evidence of Scott's thought crimes, shall we? The first example that they cite within the piece tried to smear Scott by saying he's an acolyte of Charles Murray of Bell Curve fame. Let's examine it. As Scott points out, Scott noted once on his blog that he agreed with Charles Murray that telling poor people to learn to code is not an effective way to respond to poverty. Well, by golly, that is something I agree with too. Might as well start writing the rising hit pieces on me. But it only gets worse. Their next accusation is that Scott compared feminists to Voldemort. Okay, let's review that claim. Scott, in 2014, compared the behavior of some annoying Tumblr feminists to Voldemort when he noticed that at the time, 7 years ago, people were taking it out of context. He edited the post, put a line through that section, and said explicitly he was referring only to a select group of bullies and not to all feminists. This is the version that the New York Times saw. They still chose to level the accusation against him, despite seeing the edit button clearly right there, did not note the context. Next, his most egregious sin is that he appears to endorse, at least in part, some views espoused in the infamous James Damore Google memo, which was basically that men and women are different, and then instead of assuming that they're the same, adopting different practices in the workplace that acknowledge differences could in fact promote better harmony, more workplace diversity. But for even acknowledging the difference, Scott has himself tarred the same way that Damore was as some sort of neo-patriarchal freak. So, let's get to the final question. Why should you care at all? First, Scott is a private citizen who just liked to blog. That was his crime. But the real problem is the New York Times itself is lashing out, smearing him in bad faith, and doing its absolute best to make him untouchable in society. It is part of a broader campaign of the Times and the institutions of elite liberalism to extend its stranglehold over all speech. We live simultaneously in the best age for speech and the worst. On the one hand, we have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, now Clubhouse, and more to express ourselves. On the other hand, though, those companies are all controlled by select few who can control what is said there. And with the exception of Clubhouse, the media has realized their real power lies in the ability to smear. They've browbeat Facebook, Twitter, and Google to be its enforcers. Those companies know by outsourcing what is true and not true to the New York Times that when the New York Times then won't write about it, meaning good press, which means no unhappy people on Wall Street, which means higher stock price. That's the devil's bargain that has been made. But with the emergence of new technologies and voices, the Times and elite media are even more vicious. They are using the worst things you can say about a person. They're reducing them to nothing. Then they're using those terms to destroy those who don't agree with them. That's why they went after Scott. He's literally an Elizabeth Warren supporter who is actually really liberal, but he doesn't fit neatly into a box. Some people read his blog who the Times don't like. Mostly Silicon Valley billionaires who refuse to bend the knee to the Times. Ergo, Scott, by proxy, must be destroyed. The same thing is going on at Clubhouse, the new live audio social network where I've been spending some time. That more good and unregulated conversation on the app is flourishing. The more the attack pieces are now being deployed. Because Vice, the New York Times' Taylor Lorenz, and others, they know this is their bread and butter. This is their power. If they lose the ability to determine what is okay to say and what is not, then they are irrelevant. So therefore, anyone new to the scene or who pulls the veil back on people's eyes as to what exactly they're up to is immediately targeted by the machine. This development is essentially how you got an oligopoly of speech control. The government itself does not control speech, but a few select media institutions who serve as quote-unquote fact-checkers and tastemakers for the companies that do basically decide who is okay and who isn't, who has got to be canceled and who gets a second chance. It's all about power. And the only thing we can hope is that we use our power as users and customers and more to support people like Scott and those who dare think freely or will never have a real safe space again. And, you know, Crystal, I've read Scott's blog for many years. I think he's a very insightful thinker and more. I was one of those people who participated in the outcry when I found out that his name was going to be made public. As he said, I am a psychiatrist, and according to our rules, we should not have our patients know what we're up to in extracurricular activity. I mean, it's not a BS excuse. It's real. Yeah. It's something actually cited even in medical guidelines. And the Times was just going to do it anyway for no reason. And as we said, he didn't do anything wrong. Like what? He holds views which are outside of, the elite mainstream or by the Times. Like this entire profile was unnecessary. It basically doxed him. And as he said, he's like, how many people are going to read my statement and my clarification?
Right.
How many people are even going to watch this segment? Probably already people who agree that are upset about it. But millions will read that and say, wow, this man is racist, he's a terrible person, and that will have immense ramifications for the rest of his life, and it's totally unjustified.
This piece, when I read it, it's so bizarre.
Yeah.
You're like, the whole time you're like, what is this actually about? I mean, seriously, like,
yeah, I agree.
Why is this here? What is the point they're really trying to make? Like, what is going on? It only makes sense in the context of they were pissed off because the backlash that came to doxing him to this reporter, and he was attacked and he felt unhappy about that, and so he found an excuse to write this little piece that's full of smears and innuendo.
Yeah.
And honestly, like the things that he rests his case on are so thin that I was surprised. Like, I would think that someone who has written as prolifically as he has would have more that you could sort of pick.
He actually writes a lot.
Like, he writes a lot.
30,000 word posts.
Anyone who's like, been in the public sphere for a long time and had a lot of different associations and written widely and been sort of fearless in their critique and whatever, of course you're going to be able to find things and say, oh, well, this connects to this person who's bad, or oh, this idea is affiliated with this bad thing. The fact that the case was so thin was sort of telling in and of itself. If you don't think that you could write a similar article about almost literally anyone who's been in the public sphere for a decent amount of time, you're fooling yourself. You really are just fooling yourself. If you want to make anyone look evil and bad and terrible, just guilt by association, oh, they know this person, who knows this person that's bad, you can accomplish that very easily. And so the fact that the New York Times, which is still the most prestigious paper in the entire world, wants to throw their weight around in this way is really genuinely disturbing. And what it's all about, here's basically what happened. People had a legitimate fear about the fact that, our politics are spiraling out of control, and things that seem to be, fringe and sort of pushed down of mainstream acceptability seem to be trickling back in. And what do we do about that? And the response from media is to say, we're going to censor and we're going to push those things out of the public sphere altogether. Now, that benefits them because they're essentially saying, like, any space that we don't have control over is bad. Yeah. That's what they do. That any space, whether it's this blog, whether it's Substack, whether it's Clubhouse, any space that we can't personally police and control must be bad and evil and wrong. And the bottom line is those spaces are competition to the New York Times and other mainstream outlets. So they see it as like a threat to their business model.
No, that's right. This is guild protectionism, plain and simple. That's it. They know that, so look, the Times is making more money than ever. That's another thing we need to acknowledge. And that's why when people are like, why do you talk about the New York Times so much? I'm like, because it's honestly more influential than it's ever been, I think. And because
especially
of
with
that.
Biden in the White House.
With Biden in the White House. Look at this. I mean, they look at the way the Biden administration freaks out about a New York Times editorial board op-ed. That alone was a matter of national policy for the Biden government to come out and say, no, this is wrong, etc. It matters because it influences elite opinion, which is what governs all of what we have today. And I really wanted to make that point about the oligopoly of speech control, which is that, yeah, the government doesn't control speech, mostly. At least it's controlled by the First Amendment and by a lot of case law whenever it comes to that. But these companies, because they are all influenced by Glenn Kessler and by the New York Times and others, Glenn Kessler's the Washington Post fact checker, they decide what they are the arbiters of truth. And we have revealed how many times on the show Glenn Kessler's straight up lies or obfuscations whenever he's fact checking somebody who disagrees with elite public opinion. It happens over and over and over and over again. And these people yet still control what gets taken down off YouTube, what doesn't. What gets taken down on Twitter, what doesn't. What gets a fact check, whatever, and what doesn't. And that is the most dangerous thing that we can have when our speech is migrated online.
Absolutely. Next on Rising, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp and Rachel Bovard are here for Team Rising. That is next.